Hey everyone, it's Prince of Asphodel. I wanted to make a short video about the Spring of Myths 2026 tournament that's happening right now. And I say short video, but I'm hoping that it's short. Knowing me, it might end up being a little longer than I anticipated. But the first thing I want to do is talk about why I would want to talk about this tournament. I'm not participating in the Spring of Myths tournament. I've never actually participated in an Unmatched tournament, but I love Unmatched and I love analyzing data. And the reason I think you out there in the world, if you're an unmatched player, but you don't really dabble in the competitiveness of the game, why would you care about this? I think looking at this stuff is important because tournaments with actual prize support, point structure, it really attracts really, really high level gameplay from really high level players all around the world. And because of that, it's kind of a window into really seeing exactly how good some matchups can be. For example, there can be a lot of debate in a matchup between one fighter and another fighter who is actually favored. And depending on what kind of opponents or what kind of players each person is, our ideas of how a certain matchup can go might differ greatly. Whereas one person might think some matchup favors one fighter, where another person, based on their own experiences, think that it's actually the opposite. And so this is a really good way, by getting all of the best players together, to look at what is really happening when some of the best players in the world play some of these matchups. Additionally, it really goes to show the ceiling of a certain fighter. There are a lot of fighters that you just, as a player, never click with, and they feel very weak. So it can be interesting if you suddenly see, oh, this character is actually winning a lot. I wonder what is going on. Or vice versa. There may be some characters that seem really, really strong every time you play them, and it might surprise you to find that they're not doing super well competitively. So those are the reasons that I think it helps to look at information like this. And I love finding this information where it's very neatly logged on tabletopleague.com, I believe. But not a lot of people like just looking through a bunch of information. So what I'm trying to do here is reorganize it to make it more appealing to the average viewer, to see if there's anything interesting going on. And by all means, if you are currently participating in this tournament or see this video after the tournament has ended, but you did participate in it, feel free to let me know. See if anything that I said made sense, or if it actually looks different from inside the tournament, or if you would disagree with anything that I said. I really like analyzing this stuff. I have a little bit too much social anxiety to sign up for these things. I probably will, maybe sometime in the future, but for now, this is what we're getting at. So right off the bat, I started paying really close attention to these tournaments in the last Winter of Champions of 2026, and I believe this was the first really high-stakes tournament where not the entire roster of all of the unmatched characters were allowed. And it looks like that is what's going to happen in the future. There are just far too many characters, and more of them are coming into the game. So what's going to happen is we're going to have a limited roster, and I think this is awesome because it's going to give different characters ways to shine differently, not only because some fighters they really struggle against are banned, but also because the maps can play a really big part in that as well. So this tournament also has my favorite format. It's a variant of the original Conquest, as opposed to Winter of Champions, which was a variant of Arsenal. In Arsenal, each player just kind of picks four fighters, and if you happen to pick the same one as your opponent, they get mirror banned, and you keep all the ones that your opponent didn't pick. That one's a little bit harder to me, especially as someone who doesn't own all of the unmatched sets, doesn't have a lot of experience with all of the unmatched sets. I tend to prioritize the non-IP sets. In this one, every player takes turns picking a character until they have the number, which would be four for this format. But before that, each player has a chance to ban three. And so six characters are always banned right off the bat before we start picking. And it's really interesting to figure out the meta of, well, which characters are feared the most. Because I will tell you, just looking at the data, there are six characters that by far and away are the most banned in this pool. And if you don't know which six those are, I encourage you to try and pause this video now and see if you can identify the six scariest fighters according to the participants in this tournament, the most banned six. But before I reveal that, of course, there are also not a limited selection of maps that are selected for this tournament. So one of the things I noticed while I was looking at this pool and first analyzing the maps, I'm sorry, they're really small, so some of you might not know what these maps are, recognize them off the top of your head. But a lot of them favor close range melee fighters, and there are not a lot of ranged friendly maps in here. There are a couple of them. I know Venice is pretty good, Soho's pretty good, but a lot of these maps, Heorot is super anti-ranged because of the doors. McMinnville is really hard on ranged because of the hard cutoffs and how easily you can force adjacency. I know Point Pleasant and Santa's Workshop and even the White House there and Sanctum Sanctorum, they're all really small, which means as a ranged character, you can't get out of the way of a really hard hitting melee character because they can always reach you on a small map. So I thought that was really interesting, and maybe one of the trade-offs they had for allowing Medusa into this tournament. So that was one of the first thoughts I had, which was actually kind of funny. Anyway, I am now going to reveal the 6 most banned characters, which are these 6. I was off by 1 or 2 that I thought might have been contenders with these 6, and at the end of the day, no, it really is just these 6 that are far and away the most banned characters. Usually, or I shouldn't say usually, but a lot of the times you see this phenomenon where the characters that are banned the most also don't have that high of a win rate, because whenever they do slip through the bans, it is specifically because the other player had a counter to that fighter. They had a plan for them in place. And so, for example, this would look something like, what's a good example here? Letting Raphael really struggles against the genie, if I recall correctly. So it would be something like letting Raphael slip through the bans, letting your opponent take him, and then picking up Genie to counter him. Or you can see the same thing with Geralt against the T-Rex, or Sinbad against Yanenge. Sinbad's not in this tournament, but you could do something similar with Bloody Mary. I saw at least one player pull that off. But what I'm trying to get at is that these 6 characters are so powerful compared to the rest of the field that their win rate is actually all incredibly good. They are all in the high 40%, if not 50s or 60%, which means not only is it the case that whenever they slip through the bans, people are picking them, but they're not even getting countered successfully. So that's pretty incredible and is a testament to the power of these 6 fighters. So what is interesting about a format like this is once you get the bans out of the way, now you have the new set of best fighters, the ones that are usually not banned. Out of the ones who aren't banned, who are the best in the field? And I thought it was really, really interesting to see who popped up because I really had no idea who it would be. But I have identified 8 here, the 8 most common fighters as of the recording, which I got all these stats on the 16th of May, if that helps. But a lot of these fighters have stayed consistent through the entire tournament. Some of these I expected, some of them are a little surprising to me. Some of them, none of us had a very good idea what to expect because they're from the newly released Stars and Stripes expansion, which this is the first tournament that they've been allowed in, which is really exciting. And that's why I love the limited pool in these tournaments that are going on nowadays. Surprisingly, Annie Christmas has been consistently the top fighter in the pool, followed very closely by Moon Knight and or Luke Cage. Those 3 have been at the top, as far as I know, for the entire tournament. But Annie Christmas is usually the number 1 up there. As far as I know, Annie Christmas didn't really start gaining traction until after the group phase of the last tournament in Winter of Champions. She is used to counter a lot of fighters that aren't super good at chewing through a huge pool of HP. I know she had a lot of success against fighters like Sinbad, a little bit of success against something like Bigfoot, but to me, she's always seemed kind of hard to play. So I don't know if the people at the top of the world in terms of Unmatched rankings feel the same way, but it kind of feels like everyone jumped on the Annie boat very recently, just because the skill level just kind of caught up to the skill level necessary to play her at a very high level. Maybe that's just me and everyone else has just known, and it's just her spot in the meta has opened up. I'm not really sure. Moon Knight and Luke Cage, it's no secret they've been really good. Moon Knight fell quite a bit with the release of the Witcher sets. I remember, I think it was Karma who famously said that he loses to every single Witcher character. And so he definitely fell out of favor there. Now, interestingly enough, almost every Witcher character is not allowed in this pool. It's really only Geralt and the Leshen. So that helps Moon Knight significantly. John Henry, as people predicted, was the best fighter from Stars and Stripes. I gotta hand it to the designers of Stars and Stripes. They really did a good job making characters that are strong enough to be relevant, but not strong enough to be dominant. And I think that's exactly what we're looking for is this power level in the new releases. So I really appreciate that. John Henry, I believe, has been in fourth place for the entire tournament, followed closely by a fighter, Donatello, who is really crushing it, but not everyone can play Donatello at a high level, is what it seems like, which is why he is a little bit lower than some of the others who have been around for longer. Geralt, if I recall correctly, because I don't think Tabletop League has data that you can split across different timelines, so I just kind of have to remember what I was seeing. And from what I recall, Geralt wasn't always in the top six where you see him now. It's only really in the last 2 or 3 weeks that he's had a very steady rise. And when I go into the statistics, we'll see why. Finally, Wyatt Earp is down here. He has the lowest win rate of the 8, but he does have a very high pick rate. And we can talk about why that is, again, when the statistics come up. Finally is the Genie, but he is not ahead of the fighters behind him by too much. So we have the Genie at some number of plays, and only a few plays behind him are fighters like Dracula and then Injin, who didn't make it into the top 8. And you might be wondering why I just chose to showcase the top 8, and that's because every fighter enters the secondary ban phase with 4 fighters. So essentially, you each ban 3, and it would have been this selection normally. Of course, there's tons of variations, tons of them, but under a if you were to imagine a game set up in this tournament setting, you would probably imagine that the 6 most banned characters are banned, and that the 8 most picked characters are picked. And after that, each player has a chance to ban one of their opponent's fighters, and so they're revealed at the same time, and 2 of those would not be used. And then finally, each player has the opportunity to ban one of their own fighters, and that way they're both left with 2. And the first player who gets a win with each of their fighters is the one who wins that round. So let me talk real quick about what these individual fighters look like. Again, Tabletop League has the statistics against the entire field, but I'm only going to talk as if this was a pool of 8 fighters, just for simplicity's sake. All right, so Annie Christmas, as you can see, is really good into this field. She only has 1 losing matchup. Granted, it is a very hard losing matchup, but if you imagine that you have Annie Christmas and your opponents picked something like, I don't know, Luke Cage, John Henry, Donatello, and Wyatt Earp, remember, you can ban one of your opponent's fighters. So all you have to do is make sure that Donatello doesn't see play, and Annie Christmas is pretty safe. There is no other fighter in this group of 8 that has an easy win against Annie Christmas. Every single one of them has to work for it, and a couple of them are very unfavored into Annie Christmas. She just happens to be one of the best counters into John Henry, and I think it's because John Henry is just a big, bulky fighter, and Annie Christmas really has a field day against those, typically because she has her ability online from the get-go. It's really interesting because I think Annie Christmas and John Henry share very similar legends in African American folklore from the South. It's funny that they're 2 of the most played characters in this tournament. Very, very cool. Yeah, that's about all that I had to say about Annie Christmas. Her overall win rate is very, very solid at 52%. So she is the most popular fighter in this tournament. However, not by much. Moon Knight has overtaken her as the number 1 spot once or twice as time has gone by, and his win rate is also very, very respectable. He is even with Donatello. He does lose slightly to John Henry, according to what the stats say for this tournament, but every other matchup is even at worst, and some of those matchups are extremely good. Wyatt Earp has been used many times into Moon Knight, and he has not won a single time, so those are pretty good odds if you're playing Moon Knight right there. This is a very good fighter to add to your pool. The next one is, I'm finding it a little bit interesting, and this is where we get to talk about how to analyze some of these stats, because I'm not entirely sure how, but Luke Cage, who has been consistently in the top 3 of the most popular fighters, his win rate is still respectable overall at 47%, but now we have to look at how many matchups he is losing among some of these more popular fighters. He's losing pretty hard to Donatello, and he's losing pretty hard to Annie Christmas. They both have very strong win rates against Luke Cage, and even Moon Knight's win rate is not pretty for the Luke Cage's side. Luke Cage does have a very good win rate against the other three in this pool. Granted, I think he's only played against the Genie once this tournament, but if you look on the stats for outside this tournament, one of the Genie's worst matchups ever is Luke Cage. So it's probable that only the people who know the Genie very well are picking up the Genie, and none of them will play them against Luke Cage if their opponents, if it exists in their opponent's pool when the draft is still going. So this is still okay, but this is definitely one of the lowest win rates we've seen so far. And I suspect that Luke Cage is only the third most popular fighter, not because his overall win rate is the highest. Now, 47% is still good, don't get me wrong, but if we look over at Moon Knight at 56 and Annie at 52, this is definitely a step down. I think it's just because Luke Cage is simpler to play. He's been around for a while, everyone kind of knows him, he's more safe, but he's also a little bit volatile. But if your defenses and attacks line up right where you need them to, the games can be really, really smooth for Luke Cage. So I just think he's naturally one of the higher quality fighters in the pool, not necessarily one with the best matchup spread. That's how I'm seeing these numbers. And then we can move on to John Henry, who, oh, if we thought Luke Cage was doing poorly, John Henry's numbers are even worse. He has one of the worst win rates we've seen yet against Annie Christmas, and this is a matchup that's been played a number of times. I don't have those numbers on this screen. I'm sorry I didn't put up how many times they've been played in this tournament. But none of the numbers here are spectacular. His best matchups are against Moon Knight, Wyatt Earp, and the Genie, and they're all kind of 60-40 matchups. That is not the highest odds. Granted, a lot of his losing matchups to things like Donatello and Geralt are also 60-40 matchups, just the other way around. But I don't know if this is anything to write home about, especially compared to some of the win rates we were seeing with Moon Knight and Annie Christmas. So I suspect that a lot like Luke Cage, now it would be wrong of me to say John Henry, like Luke Cage, has been around for a long time, but in a similar way, they are both a lot simpler to play, and it is immediately clear how powerful these characters are when playing them. And so I think that gives players maybe almost, you could say, a false sense of security in terms of how likely they are to win. Now, overall, John Henry's win rate is still a very respectable 47%, which is exactly where Luke Cage was. This is not a low enough percentage to call a character bad. You just have to make sure that your opponent doesn't take enough of these bad matchups, and usually you'd want to avoid that by making sure that maybe you pick up Annie Christmas or you take Luke Cage, and that way your opponent doesn't get to draft enough counters to John Henry, so you can at least ban one of them and maybe try your luck into one of those 40% matchups, see if you can get map advantage and go from there. 40% is still not that bad of a loss. So overall, still a decent character. Donatello is boasting the highest win rate we've seen yet, which I think was 57 or 56 from Moon Knight. Donatello's at a whopping 59, just a point under 60%, and he has been above 60% at some points in this tournament. And this matchup spread is actually insane. He's not losing to a single one of the top 8, and he has incredibly strong matchups into some of them. Those being Annie Christmas, Luke Cage, Wyatt Earp. I honestly believe that Donatello should be higher up in the play percentages because these win rates are just absolutely absurd. And like I alluded to earlier, I think the only reason he's not in the top 3 of the most used fighters, or even in the top 6 of the most banned fighters, is because he is the most complicated of the turtles to play perfectly. And so maybe the entire pool of players isn't comfortable piloting Donatello or isn't even familiar with his matchups into some of these fighters. That may be what's going on. I know that the Turtles, the TMNT set, is one of the newer releases at this point in time, so it's possible that in some parts of the world there hasn't been a lot of time to play with them. And even though I don't fall into that part of the world, being from here in the United States, I don't own the TMNT expansion, so I also would have no idea how to play Donatello. But I really think that's what's curbing his play percentages here, because his win rate is absolutely ludicrous. Not a single losing matchup here. He only slightly fears Moon Knight, Genie, Geralt, John Henry, and he has really respectable matchups against 2 of the top 3 in the roster, that being Annie Christmas and Luke Cage. Here, Geralt of Rivia, if I recall correctly, he has been rising steadily. So that means it implies that people didn't at first realize that Geralt would have been a good pick in this tournament. And only very recently have people been noticing, hey, he actually has some solid matchups across the board. It doesn't look so solid compared to the rest of the top eight right here. We have a pretty hard loss against Moon Knight, definitely subpar against Annie Christmas and Donatello, though they're not instant losses by any means. Some of his even matchups include Luke Cage and John Henry, okay. And some of his winning matchups are just the fifth, or would it be the sixth and eighth most played fighter, which is definitely not as good as Donatello beating the top fighter in the tournament over here, but it's still not nothing. I think the idea behind Geralt is that he's very, very safe. As long as we ignore Moon Knight here, he actually has a non losing matchup against everything else in the top tier, which means you can't just win freely against Geralt. Every single one of these fighters has to work for it. And some of these fighters, like Wyatt Earp, he has a very small chance of beating Geralt of Rivia. So that is pretty neat of Geralt to have climbed. And I love it when you see things like that in a tournament where a fighter starts with a much smaller percentage of play and then slowly rises up as people start to notice, oh, actually, he's pretty safe into this field. If you know how to pilot him well, you can pick up wins against almost any of these fighters. So that's really, really cool. A similar thing, I think, based on what I could observe, happened to Annie Christmas last tournament in the Winter of Champions, where she had not a big percentage of plays in the group stages, and then suddenly people started picking her up more and more in the elimination stages. So it's cool to see that from Geralt here. And it's cool to see that not everything is obvious right from the get-go in these limited metas, which is why they're so much fun to analyze and, I assume, to play in as well. Finally, we have Wyatt Earp, who has by far the lowest win percentages of the top 8 fighters picked. And even through that, he is the 7th most picked fighter at this time, and he has consistently been very, very high this tournament. So there's a little bit of a paradox here. How can it be true that everyone is picking this fighter when it's also true that everyone seems to be losing with this fighter at the same time? That's kind of weird. The way I reason this in my brain is similar to John Henry, but perhaps to a greater degree. It is very apparent that Wyatt Earp is strong. He has strong things going on. And it feels like you were maybe in positions that were close to winning in most, if not every game. And then you don't win, but it felt like the matchup wasn't that bad at the end. I liken him to something like Robin Hood back in the day, where everyone understood Robin Hood is ranged and he has some really strong attacks. He has a 5, a ranged 4, he has uncounterable 2s from his outlaws. So everyone understood, yeah, if you're not ready for it, this character can just pump you full of lead and you'll die. But at the same time, the matchups, they're kind of apparent that against the other 7 in the top 8, his win rate is abysmal. And it doesn't look too much better for him going past the top 8. Even fighters that he should be countering with a bunch of 1 HP sidekicks like Dracula and Medusa, he doesn't have that high of a win rate against them. Part of the reason might be that maybe there's a lack of experience on the Wyatt side. Part of the reason might be that in this particular limited pool, a lot of the maps, like I talked about at the beginning, favor melee fighters and not ranged fighters. So it could be the case that if the maps were a little bit more open-ended, and a lot of ranged fighters would benefit from that. And Wyatt Earp might be one of those. But for now, I'm not sure. He just doesn't seem to be performing as well as his usage would indicate that he is. So this is something that we might see drop off as the tournament progresses. Maybe a lot of people, because Wyatt Earp is one of the easier fighters to play, feel comfortable using him. But once the percentages start to sink in for everyone, and once players start being eliminated, it's possible we see Wyatt Earp fizzling down in terms of usage. But for now, he is still in the top 8. And speaking of which, the final fighter in the top 8 is the Genie. This is one that I did not predict, but it does make a little bit of sense because the Genie's one of those characters where he's just so terrifying to play against. And sure enough, he has really, really decent matchups into a lot of fighters like Wyatt Earp here. It just so happens that a lot of those fighters are not the members of the top 8. Like we talked about, he basically can't beat Luke Cage. He really struggles into Moon Knight. He really struggles into Geralt. and he can hold his own against Annie Christmas, John Henry, and Donatello. So overall, not the greatest spread you want to see for a fighter like the Genie, but the Genie is maybe what I'll say the first of these 8 fighters that is almost exclusively a counter pick. You don't go and pick Genie as the first fighter in your pool. You see how the draft progresses. You take your safe fighters. You have one player take Moon Knight. Well, you'll have the other player take Luke Cage. We'll have the first player take Annie Christmas. The second player, excuse me, take Donatello. And then maybe once you start getting to the end, you'll see, okay, so maybe my opponent has this fighter, this fighter, this fighter. I know that if I ban this fighter, then he's totally open to the Genie, so we'll pick that one up. And as a result, despite all of these red numbers that you're seeing on the screen, the Genie is boasting a very respectable 51% win rate. That means he's technically won more games than he's lost. So by being a really safe counter pick, the Genie is being able to pick up a lot of wins across the board. All right, so almost done here. I just want to talk about what we can expect after we get out of the group stages, which from what I understand will last about another month. I don't exactly recall how many group stage games are going to be played, but once we have our eliminations, we're going to go into the elimination round, and then you're no longer playing for points to see who can get out of the group. It's just one single round, and whoever wins it advances to the next one. Whoever loses it is eliminated from the tournament. So here are some predictions that I'm going to make as an observer from the outside. I think that fighters like Annie Christmas, Moon Knight, Geralt of Rivia, and Donatello will retain their high pick rates and keep their high win rates. And that is because they had a really good spread of win rates against each other, and therefore there's no reason that I can see that they will drop off. However, other characters like John Henry, possibly Luke Cage, and definitely Wyatt Earp, we might start to see them fall out of favor. And it's for reasons that I was talking about before. A lot of these fighters are on the simpler side. Maybe they're a little bit of a comfort fighter. People think that they can perform well with them, and they kind of do, except for they don't end up picking up these necessary wins. And when wins become necessary, and some of the weaker, less experienced fighters start getting eliminated from the tournament, it's going to start becoming very apparent that the win rates of some of these characters do not justify their high pick rates, and we might start to see some of those numbers drop off. So we'll see if I'm correct about that. And finally, because the higher level drafting is going to be in play, a lot of people who are smarter, more experienced about their decisions, because drafting is really, really hard, guys. I'm not trying to call people dumb here. It's really an art being able to draft, especially in a format so elaborate where you have to pick 4 fighters and then predict what your opponent is going to ban from you and ban you from them accordingly, and then figure out. It's a lot. It's a headache. I think that might actually end up increasing win rates of the counter picks. And the only counter pick that I got to talk about was the Genie. And so with this last slide, I wanted to showcase some of the others that we might see starting to pop up a little bit more. Some of these fighters have already been seen to pop up here and now and get a necessary win against one of the higher level fighters. So that's mostly what we're going to be seeing. I know Dracula wasn't in the top 8, but he is, I believe, the 9th, if not 10th best or most used fighter in this tournament. So all of the fighters on the left side of the arrows are fighters that are not picked very often, but actually have pretty good matchups into some of the most picked fighters. And so those are some of the fighters that we might see start to bump up in the win rates just to pop up and counter some of the pool of the opponent's fighters. So if you caught my last video about Muhammad Ali, it was actually this tournament that turned me on to the idea that he might not be as bad as people were thinking, because a lot of players, like Angel Cake, were picking him up and getting really good wins, solid wins against really powerful fighters like Annie Christmas. And as fighters like Geralt maybe start to rise in popularity, some of its predators like the Chupacabra will start to come up and maybe hammer them in. And we'll see if that ends up warping the meta. I know Donatello has very few hard counters. Even InGen here that I have highlighted doesn't have a slam dunk matchup into him. So that's one of the reasons I think he's going to retain that high win rate. But we're going to see. We're going to see how this progresses, and hopefully we'll get to learn a lot of cool things about the meta, and hopefully we'll get to learn some information that helps us better our own games. For example, maybe you seeing this graph at George Washington has a high win rate against Annie Christmas. He does in this tournament. He has there haven't been that many games played, but his win rate is a respectable 60 or 70 something percent. So maybe that's a matchup you might want to try. Maybe say, okay, if I've struggled against one of these fighters in the past, like Moon Knight, maybe Shredder really demolishes him. I don't know. Just neat little things to think about. And hopefully I'll have another one of these videos analyzing the tournament come out once it is nearing its end or once it ends, period. But for now, this is all I had. Thank you guys so much for watching. Now I'll catch you on the next one.